W.F. House presents an unabridged recording of Bless Your Heart by Lindy Ryan, narrated by Stephanie Németh-Parker.
Prologue. Edwin Boone. Edwin Boone was not the kind of man to be intimidated by a walk in the dark. He wasn't the kind of man to cower in the face of anything, really. Country-born and cornbread raised, Ed was the kind of man those softer, yellow-belly types he saw out around town liked to call good old boys. He had enough marbles to know the term was meant as an insult, but Ed had never been able to riddle out why. It wasn't like there was anything wrong with attending church every Sunday, paying your bills in hard-earned cash, and thanking the good Lord every night to be an American. Men from Ed's generation were just made of sterner stuff, he often reasoned. More grit and less gravy. Just the way it was. He had, after all, served 2 tours in Korea, fighting a war against communism on the other side of the globe, and making it back home when over 30,000 of his brothers in arms had not. Nothing thickened the soul and hardened the gut like watching a man bleed out in your arms. And by Ed's own approximation, he'd done that very thing no less than a dozen times. Maybe more. Probably more, he thought and shrugged. Probably a lot more. Ed's memory wasn't quite what it used to be, not that it mattered. All of those men were dust in the ground now. Hell, almost everyone Ed had ever cared about was dust in the ground. His brother, his best friend, his favorite dog, his wife. He'd buried more friends and acquaintances these last few years than he could remember. If it hadn't been for the little 1-by-2-inch cuts of newspaper he clipped from their obituaries and kept in a pile on his bedside table, Ed would have forgotten their names just as easily as he'd forgotten those of the men who'd died in his arms. All except his wife's, of course. Her name was imprinted on his soul. Her memory embedded in the gold wedding band Ed still wore on his left hand, in the faded tattoo inked on his left biceps. She'd been a good woman, his Darlene. Good until the very end. Better'n you ever deserved, Ed thought. After the war, Ed had gone straight back to the small, rural southeast Texas town where he'd been born, married his high school sweetheart, and worked every shift his boss would give him at the fair store. When he'd saved up enough money, Ed had bought a scratch of land on the edge of town and built a home. He'd raised 3 kids, 7 dogs, and more feral tomcats than he could count on.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?